Some packs fall to war, some fall to fire. Hollowmere fell to a girl they didn't think was worth watching. They called it a trial. Everyone gathered to see her fail it, and she did, beautifully, the way they'd arranged for her to fail it months before she ever climbed that ridge. She went over the edge believing her own pack had simply asked too much of her. She never felt the ground shift beneath the survivors. Within minutes, every wolf on patrol dropped out of their shift mid-stride. With no enemy in sight, and no reason anyone could name, the land had started keeping score, and Hollowmere hadn't even noticed it was losing. This isn't a story about getting even. It's a story about a debt the land itself was already collecting, long before she ever opened her eyes again. Stay, watch them find out what they actually killed. If you've ever wanted to see the quiet ones finally get seen, subscribe before we begin. There are more stories like this one waiting, and you won't want to miss where they go. Chapter 1. Every pack keeps a story it tells its pups about the trial of ascension. A climb up Hollow Ridge, a leap across the Widow's Gap, a landing on the far ledge that proves a wolf's body and spirit are ready to be counted among the grown. It is supposed to be dangerous in the way a father's hand is dangerous when it teaches a child to swim. Close enough to fear to mean something, never close enough to drown. Freya Thorn had grown up believing this, the way she believed the sun would rise without asking permission. She stood at the lip of Hollow Ridge in the gray hour before noon, wind dragging at her braid, and told herself the old story one more time. Close enough to fear, never close enough to drown. Below her, Hollowmere's entire pack had gathered on the slope to watch. Nearly 400 wolves in human skin, breath fogging in the cold, the way they always gathered for a trial. It was supposed to be a celebration disguised as a test. Freya had watched a dozen of these as a girl, had cheered for cousins and neighbors, had never once doubted the ground beneath the leap. She did not doubt it now, either. That was the cruelty of it. 3 people stood apart from the crowd, near the ceremonial stones, watching her with 3 different faces. Damon Blackwood, acting alpha since his father's hip had failed him last winter, watched with the steady patience of a man counting down a debt. Beside him, Cassandra, the pack's truth keeper, the woman who had measured every pup's bloodline since before Freya could walk, watched with no expression at all, which was somehow worse than the alternative. And just behind them, arms crossed, stood Garrett Stone, who had once taught Freya to throw a knife, and now wouldn't meet her eyes. "Begin when ready," Cassandra called, and her voice carried the practiced calm of someone who had said the words 100 times and meant them honestly every time but this one. Freya nodded. She did not know, could not have known, that the rope bridge logged in the ceremony's records as inspected this morning, sound had been quietly weakened sometime in the night. She did not know that her bloodline reading, filed away 18 years ago in Cassandra's own hand, had been altered twice since, first as a precaution, the second time as an insurance policy. She did not know that the wolf inside her, which she had been told her whole life was unremarkable, modest, fine, but nothing special, was nothing of the sort. She only knew what she had been taught to know, which was the entire design of the thing. She ran. She leapt. For 1 full second, the watching pack made the sound packs make when something goes exactly as it should, a held breath, ready to release into cheering. Then the rope gave. It did not snap dramatically. It simply let go, the way a held promise lets go when no one's been keeping it. Freya's hand closed on air where a second handhold should have been, and the ground that should have caught her 30 feet below the gap did not, because the gap was never 30 feet. It was 300, down to the river that cut through Hollow Ridge like a wound that had never quite healed. The crowd's held breath became a scream instead. Freya did not have time to be afraid in any way that made sense to her later. There was wind, and the gray smear of stone going past too fast to be real, and one clear, furious thought rising up through the panic, like the only solid thing left in the world. They knew. Not the fall, not the river. They knew, and they let me climb anyway. She hit the water at an angle that should have killed her outright, and very nearly did. On the ridge, Damon Blackwood did not look away, because looking away would have been a kind of confession. Cassandra's face remained perfectly composed. Garrett Stone turned and walked back toward the pack house without a word, and if anyone noticed that his hands were shaking, no one said so aloud. Hannah Bennett noticed. She was 19, new to the patrol rotation, and she had liked Freya since they were children, had liked the quiet, careful way Freya did everything, never showing off, never asking for more than her share. Hannah had cheered loudest of anyone on the slope, and now she stood frozen, staring down at the river with her hand pressed over her mouth, waiting for Freya to surface the way the trial always promised she would. She did not surface. What happened next, Hannah would later swear to, though no one believed her for almost a season. The wind that had been screaming across the ridge all morning simply stopped. Not died down. Stopped, the way a held breath stops, mid-inhale, with nowhere to go. And every wolf on the eastern patrol line, 4 of them, a full mile out, mid-stride, mid-shift, felt their wolves let go of them without warning, dropping them back into bare human skin in the open cold, with no danger in sight and no reason any of them could name. They would call it a strange wind for weeks afterward, a coincidence of weather and nerves. It was not a coincidence. It was the first mark in a ledger that had just opened, and the land does not forgive a debt simply because no one can read the handwriting yet. There is a thing elders say, in the old way of telling it, that a pack's ground only ever loves the people the pack itself has forgotten to protect. Hollowmere had forgotten Freya Thorn so thoroughly, for so long, that no one standing on that ridge understood yet that the forgetting was about to come due. Below them, in water cold enough to stop a human heart twice over, something in Freya's blood that had been folded small her entire life, quietly, deliberately, the way a secret is folded to fit in a pocket, began, for the first time, to unfold. Chapter 2. There is a kind of silence that means peace, and a kind that means something has stopped breathing. Hollowmere's elders, the ones old enough to remember the last time the border sense had gone quiet, knew the difference within the hour, even if no one yet had the courage to say it aloud. Border sense was not a power Hollowmere's wolves had ever had to think about. It simply was a low, constant awareness at the back of every shifted mind, the way a sleeper knows the shape of their own room in the dark. Cross a boundary line that wasn't yours, and every wolf on the territory felt the intrusion the way a held hand feels a stranger's grip. It had been that way for longer than the pack's oldest stories remembered. By nightfall on the day of the trial, it was simply gone. Damon Blackwood stood in his father's old study, his study now, though he had never once managed to think of it that way, and listened to Garrett Stone describe 4 patrol wolves who had dropped out of their shift for no reason, and a border sense that had gone dark for no reason, and tried to keep his face the way a leader's face is supposed to look when there is, in fact, a reason, and he is the reason. Could be the storm front, Garrett offered, though his voice had none of its usual certainty in it. Pressure change. Wolves are sensitive to that. The border sense isn't sensitive to weather, Damon said. It's sensitive to threat. Then maybe there's a threat. Or maybe, Damon said, and stopped himself before the sentence finished, because the end of it was a thought he was not yet willing to let exist in a room with another living person. Cassandra arrived without knocking, which was her right as truth-keeper, and closed the study door behind her with a care that suggested she did not want the rest of the house listening. "The trial records are filed," she said. "Rope failure, weather-related fraying, ruled an accident. I backdated the inspection log myself." She said it the way she might report on supply stores or weather patterns. Competent, contained. A woman doing the job she had always done. "There's no version of this that points back to us, Damon, not unless someone goes looking specifically for what isn't there. And the wind," Damon said, "and the patrols, and whatever in God's name happened to the border sense. Weather," Cassandra said. "Coincidence. Grief making people see signs in clouds." She did not believe it. Damon could see that she did not believe it, in the particular stillness of her hands, folded together too carefully, the stillness of someone holding something steady so it would not shake. Hannah Bennett did not sleep that night, and she was not alone in that. She sat at the edge of the gathering hall with 3 other patrol wolves who had felt their shifts forced shut that morning, all of them turning the same useless theories over and over, none of them quite willing to say the word Freya first, as though naming her might make the grief more permanent than it already was. "It started right when she fell," Hannah finally said. "The wind. I was watching her the whole way down, and the second she hit the water, it just stopped." "That's not how border magic works," said one of the older patrol wolves, not unkindly. "It's not personal like that. It doesn't know who anybody is." Maybe it should, Hannah said, and no one had an answer for that. By the second morning, the hunters came back from the eastern woodline with empty hands, and stranger reports than empty hands alone would explain. The deer that should have been thick in the lower meadows at this season were simply gone, not scattered, not spooked into hiding, but absent in a way that suggested they had left the territory entirely days before the hunters ever arrived to find them. The birds that nested along the ridge had gone quiet. Even the fish in the upper river, the part of the shadow vein that ran clean above the falls, had thinned out enough that the two boys sent to check the lines came back saying the water itself felt wrong, though neither of them could explain what wrong was supposed to feel like. Hollowmere had never, in living memory, gone hungry from its own territory, in the same week it had lost a member. The elders who remembered the old teachings, the ones who still kept to the belief that a pack's land loves only what the pack protects, began, quietly, to ask questions that no one in the ruling council wanted asked. Damon called a closed meeting of the council that evening, the kind that excluded everyone below a certain rank, which in practice meant it excluded everyone who might have said something true. "We tell the pack it's a passing thing," he said. "Weather, migration, a hard season. We do not tell them it started with the trial. There's no benefit to anyone in connecting those two things. There's a third option," Cassandra said carefully. "We could simply tell the truth. The rankings were never what they should have been. The trial was an accident," Damon said. Too fast. And the room went still in the particular way rooms go still when everyone in it knows a lie has just been spoken, and has decided, together, silently, to let it stand. Garrett did not speak again for the rest of the meeting. He had not slept either. Twice that day he had walked to the edge of Hollow Ridge and looked down at the river, as if there were still some chance of an answer down there worth climbing for, and twice he had walked away without climbing. It is an old and uncomfortable truth, rarely spoken at gatherings, that a pack's wrongdoing is never carried only by the wolves who chose it. It is carried, too, by everyone close enough to feel its weather change, and far enough from the truth to mistake the chill for something else, for a hard season, for bad luck, for a storm with no name. Hollowmere's wolves felt the chill that week and called it grief, because grief was the only word in their grasp large enough to hold a feeling they could not yet name correctly. They were not wrong to grieve. They were only wrong about what, exactly, they were grieving for, because 300 feet below the ridge, in water that should have stopped a heart twice over, the thing they had spent 18 years convincing themselves did not exist, had just opened its eyes for the first time, alone, and very much alive. Chapter 3. Riker Kane had not crossed into Hollowmere territory in 11 years, and he had sworn, the last time he left it, that he never would again. His pack, Greywater, 3 valleys to the east, had buried 2 wolves the last time a Hollowmere border dispute turned to claws instead of words, back when his father still ran patrols, and Riker was young enough to think a grudge was something you were supposed to keep your whole life, the way you kept a scar. He had not come looking for Hollowmere's river that morning. He had come looking for a missing hunting dog, off Greywater's own land, and had followed its tracks further than he meant to, until the trees thinned, and the shadow vein opened up in front of him, swollen and pale with cold. That was where he found her. Not the dog, never the dog. The dog had the good sense to have already turned back, but a girl, barely breathing, dragged half onto a gravel bank by a current that by every law of weight and force should have kept her. Riker's first thought, looking at her, was the old grudge, sharp and automatic as a reflex. Hollowmere. He could smell the pack on her even through the blood and the river. 11 years, 2 graves, and his first instinct on finding a half-drowned Hollowmere wolf on his own family's account was something close to satisfaction. His second thought arrived a half-second later and was considerably less comfortable. She's a child. Whatever debt my pack carries, it isn't owed by her. He crouched beside her anyway, telling himself it was only to confirm she was already gone, that there would be no decision to make because there would be nothing left requiring one. She was not gone. Her chest rose, shallow and wrong, but rising. "Hell," Riker said, to no one, and picked her up. He did not bring her back to Greywater's main pack house. Too many old eyes, too many old wars. But to his own cabin on the western edge of his territory, the one he'd built himself after his father died, and the pack house had stopped feeling like a place he wanted to sleep. He laid her on the single bed, packed the worst of her wounds with what he had, and sat in a chair across the room with his arms crossed, watching her breathe, trying to work out what exactly he thought he was doing. There was no spark when he touched her wrist to check her pulse. No jolt, no recognition, no sense of the universe quietly rearranging itself around a discovery. There was only a girl, badly broken, breathing in a bed that wasn't hers, in a territory that hated where she came from. He decided, somewhere in the second hour of watching her, that he would help her because helping her cost him nothing he wasn't already willing to spend, and because the old grudge, when he actually looked at it directly, instead of carrying it out of habit, had never once been about a girl who hadn't yet been born when the graves were dug. That was all. It did not feel like fate. It felt like a decision, made once, that he could revisit and unmake at any point he chose to. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not want to unmake it. She woke on the third day, eyes opening to a ceiling she didn't recognize, in a body that did not, somehow, ache in all the places it should have. "You're in Greywater territory," Riker said, before she could ask, before the fear in her face could curdle into something worse. "Pulled you out of the river 3 days back. You're safe. Nobody here is going to hurt you." "Greywater," she repeated, voice raw, and something in her face shifted. Not relief, not yet, but recognition of a name that belonged to a story her own pack had told her about old enemies. "You hate Hollowmere." "My father did," Riker said. "I'm starting to think my father was wrong about a number of things. He studied her, not the way Hollowmere's faction had studied her on the ridge, weighing her against a rigged number, but plainly, the way you study something you genuinely don't understand yet. You want to tell me why your own pack let you walk a rope they knew was going to break?" Freya did not answer that. Not because she didn't believe it, but because some small, loyal, foolish part of her was still trying to find a version of the story where it had simply been an accident. Riker did not push. He had learned, over 11 years of carrying a grudge he hadn't earned, that some truths only arrive on their own schedule, and that pushing them only teaches a person to hide better. He fed her broth and bread for 2 more days, and asked no more questions she wasn't ready to answer, and in that silence, something began to take root that had nothing to do with magic, and everything to do with the simple, unglamorous fact of being shown decency by someone who owed her none. 3 valleys away, at the edge of what used to be uncontested Hollowmere ground, Garrett Stone stood at first light and counted 4 sets of unfamiliar tracks pressed into the frost. Boots, not paws, which meant scouts who'd shifted back before crossing. Careful, deliberate, the way you move when you're checking whether a door is locked before you try the handle. He had patrolled this border for 15 years. No outside pack had set foot this close to Hollowmere's heart in all that time. The border sense that should have screamed the intrusion the moment those boots touched the frost had said nothing at all, because the border sense had said nothing at all in 5 days, and Garrett was beginning to understand, in the cold, specific way a man understands a wound only after the shock wears off, that the silence was not a passing thing. He did not report the tracks to Damon that morning. He stood at the border a long while instead, looking east, toward valleys that had never once needed scouting before, and found himself thinking, for the first time letting the thought finish, "We are not just unlucky, we are undefended, and I know exactly when that started. It is said, in the oldest tellings, that a debt unpaid does not wait patiently in one place. It travels. It finds the cracks in a wall before the wall's own builders notice they exist. Hollowmere's wall had been cracking for 5 days, quietly, while its keepers argued over the right words to describe a weather pattern. 3 valleys west, in a cabin that smelled of wood smoke and bread, a girl who had been taught her whole life that she was unremarkable was beginning, slowly, to heal in ways that made absolutely no sense for someone who had fallen 300 feet into freezing water 5 days before. And a man who owed her nothing was starting to wonder, quietly, whether the thing he'd pulled from that river was a great deal more than a girl who'd had bad luck with a rope. Chapter 4. Healing, Freya was discovering, was not the same thing as recovering. Her body had mended in a handful of days what should have taken a season. Riker had said nothing about it, but she'd seen the look on his face the morning he changed her bandages, and found skin instead of wound underneath. What hadn't mended, what perhaps wasn't going to mend on any reasonable schedule, was the simple architecture of what she'd believed about herself for 22 years. She had always understood, the way you understand the color of your own eyes, that her wolf was modest, steady, unremarkable in the specific, quiet way that nobody ever calls a flaw outright, but that everyone treats as one regardless. The kind of unremarkable that gets a girl assigned to the herb gardens instead of the patrol line. Gently, kindly, with reasons that always sounded sensible at the time. "Show me," Riker said, on the 7th day, out behind the cabin where the trees opened into a clearing he used for his own training. "Shift for me, not for show, just so I can see what I'm actually looking at." Freya hesitated, the old shame rising automatically, the apology already forming in her mouth. "It's nothing special, I should warn you," and then stopped herself, because some new and unfamiliar irritation had started growing alongside the shame, asking a question she'd never let herself ask before. Who decided that, and on what evidence? She shifted. It was not, by any measure she'd ever been taught, a remarkable transformation. No blinding light, no roar that shook the trees. Her wolf came up the way it always had, quietly, almost apologetically, fur the color of wet stone, smaller than she remembered other wolves looking at her own age. Riker studied her for a long moment, walked a slow half-circle around her, and frowned in a way that had nothing to do with disappointment. "Shift back," he said. "I want to ask you something, and I want a straight answer. When you were young, did anyone ever measure you? Formally. Bloodline trials, the kind where they read your line against the old registries? Cassandra did, when I was 4. Said my line was clean, but ordinary. Said it again at 12, at the coming-of-age trial. Same result both times." Freya frowned. "Why does that matter?" "Because your wolf doesn't move like an ordinary line," Riker said carefully. "It moves like something that's been taught, very deliberately, to take up less space than it actually has. I've seen suppressed wolves before. Greywater had a boy once, sick from birth. His wolf genuinely couldn't reach full size. That's not what I just watched. What I watched was a wolf that knows exactly how big it could be, and has been told, every day of its life, not to be that big in front of anyone." The words landed in Freya the way the fall itself had landed. Sudden, bone deep, taking a long moment to actually hurt. "That's not possible," she said, though some treacherous part of her recognized the shape of the idea instantly. The way you recognize a key fitting a lock you'd convinced yourself had no key at all. Cassandra wrote it down, twice, filed it with the council. "Cassandra also told your whole pack a rope failed from weather," Riker said, not unkindly. "I wasn't there, but I know what frayed from age looks like, and I know what cut clean and left to look frayed looks like, because I've spent 11 years checking my own pack's lines against exactly that kind of sabotage. Someone wanted you measured small, Freya. The question that actually matters isn't whether it's possible, it's why." Freya sat with that question through the rest of the day, turning it over the way she might turn over a stone looking for the insect underneath, and did not like any of the answers that came to her, because every answer required believing that people who had raised her, fed her, taught her to swim and hunt, and grieve her own parents, people she had called family her entire life, had looked at a 4-year-old girl and decided, calmly, that whatever she carried was inconvenient enough to bury. "If it's true," she said finally, "I want to know how. Not just that they lied. How? What did they actually do?" "Then we find out," Riker said, carefully. "You're not walking back into Hollowmere yet. Not broken, not unprepared, and not for revenge. If you go back because you've decided to, with your eyes open, not because you're still bleeding from what they did." Back in Hollowmere, on the morning of the 8th day, Damon Blackwood stood before the full gathered pack to perform the binding rite. The same rite his father had performed 100 times without incident. The simple, ceremonial joining of alpha to territory that every pack repeated each season as a matter of routine. More habit than magic, the kind of thing nobody thought to be nervous about. He raised his hand over the ceremonial stone, the way he'd watched his father do it since he was a boy, and spoke the old words, and felt nothing. Not resistance, not pain, simply nothing, the rite sliding past him like water past a closed hand. refusing to take hold at all. He tried again. The pack, 400 strong, watched their alpha repeat a child's ceremony twice in front of them, and the murmur that started at the back of the gathering moved forward like weather. "Something's wrong with the stone," Damon said, too quickly, and heard how thin it sounded even as he said it. Cassandra, watching from the edge of the gathering, did not offer a correction this time. She simply watched her alpha fail a rite that had never failed in living memory, and felt, for the first time since the trial, something that was not quite guilt, but stood very close beside it. The cold, specific understanding that whatever they had broken 8 days ago was not finished breaking, and that it had just, very publicly, begun breaking him. Hannah Bennett, standing near the back with the other young patrol wolves, watched Damon's hand fall back to his side a second time, and thought of the wind that had stopped the moment Freya hit the water, and found herself thinking a thought she did not say aloud, because it felt too large and strange to survive being spoken. It isn't punishing all of us. It's punishing him specifically. It knows the difference. There is an old saying among packs old enough to remember a time before written law, that the land does not forgive on a schedule of apology. It forgives on a schedule of repair. Hollowmere's council had spent 8 days managing a story, instead of mending what the story was meant to hide. And the ground beneath them, patient as only something ancient can be patient, had simply begun keeping its own count. 3 valleys west, a girl who had spent her whole life believing herself small, was beginning, for the first time, to ask not what is wrong with me, but what was done to me. And that single change in the question, quiet as it was, would turn out to matter a great deal more than any rope ever had. Chapter 5. Riker did not take Freya back toward Hollowmere that week, or the week after. Instead, he took her east, deeper into Greywater territory, to a small holding at the edge of the valley, where an old man named Owen Walker had lived alone for the better part of 15 years, tending bees and avoiding the company of other wolves with a thoroughness that struck most people as eccentric, and struck Riker, who had grown up 2 farms over, as something closer to grief that had simply never finished healing. "Owen used to be Hollowmere," Riker explained on the walk over. "Left before I was born. My father always said it was a falling out over territory rights, and maybe that was true once, but the way he talks about it now, it's not territory he's bitter about." Owen received them on his porch with the careful, measuring look of a man who had spent a long time deciding which strangers were worth opening his door to, and went very still the moment his eyes settled on Freya. Thorn line," he said, not a question. "You've got Margot's eyes. Knew her, before she married in." "You knew my mother?" "Knew what she was," Owen said, and something in the bluntness of it made Freya's stomach drop before she understood why. "Same as I knew what I was, once. Before Cassandra's predecessor decided it was inconvenient information." He told it slowly, the way old men tell things they've rehearsed alone for years without ever expecting an audience. He had been Hollowmere born, he said, and at 16 had been measured by the truth keeper of that era, Cassandra's own mentor, a woman named Celine, long dead now, and told that his line carried something old, something the council of the time decided was a problem rather than a gift, because a wolf that strong, unaligned to any of the 3 ruling families, upset a balance of power 3 families had spent generations building. "They didn't push me off a cliff," Owen said. "Wasn't their method, back then. They just adjusted the paperwork, told me I'd tested ordinary, told my own parents the same. I spent 30 years believing it, right up until the day my wolf came up unbidden during a border skirmish, and tore through 4 attackers like they were nothing. And even then, you know what the council told the rest of the pack? Adrenaline. A fluke. Easier to call a miracle a fluke than admit you'd buried something on purpose." "How?" Freya said, the same question she'd been carrying since the clearing with Riker. "How do you adjust a bloodline reading? What's the actual mechanism?" Owen reached into a chest by the door, the kind of careful, deliberate movement of a man retrieving something he'd protected for a long time, and produced a small, flat stone, dark as river slate, etched with markings worn nearly smooth. "Reading stone," he said. "Every truth keeper uses one. You press a pup's palm to it during the trial, and it shows the keeper the shape of the bloodline underneath. What's there, how deep it runs. Used to be, the stone showed the keeper, and the keeper told the truth about what they saw." He turned it over in his hand. "What Celine taught Cassandra, What I'd bet good money Cassandra's still doing is that the stone can be primed beforehand. A drop of the keeper's own blood, worked into the markings the night before, and the reading comes back capped. Shows whatever ceiling the keeper decided on ahead of time, no matter what's actually underneath. You're certain, Riker said. I watched Celine do it to 3 different children over the years before I understood what I was watching, Owen said. By the time I understood, it was too late to matter for me. I'm telling you now because it's clearly not too late for her. He nodded at Freya without sentiment, the plain nod of a man passing along a tool rather than offering comfort. If you want proof that survives a council's word against yours, you don't need my memory. You need the stone itself, and a witness who knows what the priming residue looks like under proper light. I'd recognize it. I'd swear to it in front of any gathering that would have me. Freya sat with the weight of that for a long while, the porch quiet except for the low working hum of Owen's bees, somewhere behind the house, indifferent to all of it. Why would she do it to me? Freya finally asked. I'm nobody's threat to a ruling family. I don't carry a name that matters. Don't you? Owen said. Thorn's an old line, girl. Older than Blackwood, if you go back far enough. Old enough that 30 years ago, before your mother married into a quieter branch of it, a Thorn with the right kind of wolf could have stood for Alpha herself. By right of blood, no vote required. Cassandra didn't cap your reading because you're nobody. She capped it because of exactly who you might have been, if anyone ever let you grow into it. It was, Freya thought, both the cruelest and the simplest answer she'd been given since the fall. Cruel, because it meant the lie had nothing to do with anything she'd done or failed to do. And simple, because it finally gave the 18 years of smallness a shape that made sense, a hand that had pressed it down on purpose. I want the stone, she said. I want it in front of the whole pack, with Owen standing beside me, so there's no version of this they can quietly file away as an accident. Then we go back when you're ready, Riker said. Not before. She thought, that night, of all the small humiliations she'd absorbed without question for 22 years, the gentle redirection away from patrol duty, the kind, sympathetic looks when others were chosen for the harder trials, the quiet, persistent sense that she simply wasn't built for more, and understood, with a clarity that felt less like anger and more like grief finally finding its correct address, that none of it had been a verdict on what she was. It had only ever been a verdict on what someone else had decided was safe for her to become. There is a particular kind of sorrow, rarely spoken aloud in the old tellings, that belongs not to the wolf who is wronged, but to the years that wrong is allowed to stand unquestioned. Every birthday, every trial, every quiet moment of believing a lie about yourself, simply because the people who loved you said it first. Freya would carry that sorrow a long while yet. But she no longer carried it alone, and she no longer carried it as if it were true. 3 valleys west, in a study that had once been his father's, Damon Blackwood read a hastily scrawled message from a Greywater contact he'd never officially acknowledged having, informing him that an old exile named Owen Walker had been seen in close company with a Greywater wolf, and a young woman matching a description no one in Hollowmere had dared put into words yet, and felt, for the first time since the right failed beneath his hand, something that was not quite fear, so much as the slow, sinking recognition of a debt finally finding its way to his door. Chapter 6. They did not announce themselves. Freya had decided, somewhere in the last quiet week at Owen's holding, that whatever justice looked like, it would not look like spectacle, not a grand entrance, not a speech rehearsed for effect. She wanted, more than anything, simply to be seen standing where they'd assumed she never would stand again. They crossed into Hollowmere territory at mid-morning. Freya, Riker, and Owen, who had insisted on coming despite his age, despite 11 years of having sworn he'd never set foot on this ground again. Some debts, he'd said. You don't get to leave unpaid just because they're inconvenient to collect. The border sense should have announced them the moment they crossed. It said nothing, the way it had said nothing in over 2 weeks, and the silence of it walked beside them like a fourth companion, all the way to the gathering hall. Freya felt it the instant she stepped past the old boundary stones. Not a flicker, not a jolt, but a kind of settling, the way a held door finally stops fighting the hand that's pushing it. Something in the land itself seemed to lean toward her, faint and unmistakable, like recognition arriving late to an introduction it should have made years ago. Word moved through the pack faster than any messenger could have carried it. By the time Freya reached the gathering hall steps, Half of Hollowmere had already gathered, drawn by a rumor none of them quite believed until they saw her standing there, alive, steady, in clothes that weren't Hollowmere's weave, flanked by a greywater wolf and a man half the pack had assumed dead. Hannah Bennett reached her first, pushing through the crowd without dignity or hesitation, and the two of them stood for a long moment simply looking at each other, because there was no single sentence built for this. "I felt it," Hannah finally said. "The wind, the day you fell. I knew it meant something." "It did," Freya said. "It still does." Damon Blackwood came out onto the hall steps with Cassandra and Garrett a half step behind him, and whatever speech he might have prepared in the 2 days since learning she was alive seemed to abandon him the moment he actually saw her, not broken, not begging, not even angry in any way he recognized from the version of this conversation he'd rehearsed. "Freya," he said, "you're alive." "I am," she said. "No thanks to the rope." A murmur moved through the gathered pack, low and uneasy, the sound of several hundred people simultaneously recalculating a story they'd accepted without question for 2 weeks. "There's no need for this to become a spectacle," Damon said, lowering his voice as though that might keep the moment contained to the hall steps alone. "Whatever happened on that ridge, we can discuss it properly, in council, without—" "You can discuss it now," Freya said, "in front of everyone who watched me fall, and was told it was an accident. I'm not interested in a private room, Damon. I spent 18 years being managed quietly. I'm done being quiet." Cassandra's face had gone the particular shade of still that meant she had already begun calculating every exit available to her, and finding fewer than she would have liked. "Owen Walker," Damon said, turning to the old man, as though changing the subject might also change the outcome. "I didn't realize you'd taken an interest in matters that haven't concerned you in over a decade." "They started concerning me again," Owen said, "the moment I learned Cassandra was still using Celine's stone, and Celine's methods, on children who deserved better than both." He produced the dark, slate-colored stone from inside his coat, and held it up plainly, for everyone close enough to see. "This is a reading stone. Properly used, it tells a truth-keeper what a bloodline actually carries. Improperly used, primed the night before with the keeper's own blood, it tells the keeper's chosen lie instead, and shows it to the whole gathered pack as if it were fact." He looked at Cassandra without malice, which seemed, somehow, to unsettle her more than anger would have. "I'd recognize the residue of priming on a stone from across a room, Cassandra. I've had 30 years to study exactly what it looks like. Would you like to hand it over willingly, or would you like me to ask the pack to watch me find it?" For a long moment, no one moved. Then Cassandra reached into her own robes, withdrew an identical stone, and set it on the ground between them without a word, because there was, in the end, no version of refusal that didn't confirm the accusation more completely than compliance would. Garrett Stone stepped forward before anyone could examine it. "I checked the rope myself, the morning of the trial," he said, voice low, addressed less to the crowd than to Freya directly. "It was sound. I logged it sound. Someone went back after my inspection and weakened it, and I didn't ask who, because some part of me already knew, and I let myself not ask." He looked at Damon, then at Cassandra, and something in his posture suggested a weight finally being set down rather than picked up. "I won't carry that quietly anymore either." Freya watched the three of them, Damon's authority visibly thinning under the weight of several hundred witnesses, Cassandra's competence finally failing to outpace her own guilt, Garrett choosing, for the first time in 2 weeks, honesty over comfort, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel standing here. Not triumph, not quite. Something closer to the particular, quiet relief of watching a held breath finally leave a room. "I'm not here to tear Hollowmere down," she said, to the whole gathered pack now, not just the 3 who'd wronged her. "I don't want a war, and I don't want a throne I haven't earned by anything other than spite. I want this pack to look at what was done, to me, and to Owen before me, and likely to others none of us know about yet, and decide, together, whether it's the kind of pack you still want to belong to." It was Hannah who spoke first into the silence that followed, her voice unsteady but clear. "We didn't know. Most of us didn't know. But we believed it anyway, because believing was easier than asking." She looked at Freya with something that might have been shame, or might simply have been the early shape of resolve. "I think that's on us too. Not the same as what they did, But not nothing either. Somewhere beneath the gathering hall, in the old stones that had held Hollowmere's ward for longer than any wolf present could remember, something settled. Not triumphant, not vengeful, only correct. The way a wound finally set properly stops aching in quite the same way. The old tellings say that a debt, once truly seen, stops behaving like a curse and starts behaving like a ledger, something that can, in fact, be paid, provided the ones who owe it are finally willing to look at the sum. Hollowmere stood on its own steps that morning and looked, for the first time in 2 weeks, at the actual number. What they chose to do about it would not be decided by Freya alone, and she had not come home expecting it to be. She had come home only to make sure, for the first time in her life, that the choice was finally being made with every true fact laid out in the light. Not buried, not capped, not quietly filed away as something easier left unmeasured. Chapter 7. A pack does not try its own alpha quickly, and Hollowmere's elders, to their credit, did not try to make it look quick now. They called for 3 days before any formal judgment, 3 days to gather testimony, to let Owen's stone be examined by elders old enough to remember Celine's methods firsthand, to let Hannah and a dozen other witnesses lay out, plainly, everything they had seen and silenced in themselves over the past 2 weeks. Freya did not press for speed. She had waited 18 years without knowing she was waiting. She found she could wait 3 more days for the truth to be handled properly, rather than quickly. She stayed at Hannah's family home, rather than the pack house, by her own choice, and spent the days mostly in quiet, walking the old paths she'd grown up on, noticing for the first time how many of them had been gently, structurally arranged to keep her at the edges of things. The herb garden instead of the training yard, the kitchens instead of the council hall. None of it had ever been stated as a rule. It hadn't needed to be. A life can be shaped almost entirely by which doors are never quite offered. Riker stayed too, though he kept a careful, deliberate distance during the day, aware that this reckoning belonged to Hollowmere and not to him. In the evenings, though, he sat with her on Hannah's porch, and they talked about nothing in particular. Greywater's bees, the better way to set a snare line, the stupid argument he'd had with his father at 19 that he still half regretted winning. It was, Freya realized one evening, the first ease she'd felt with another person in longer than she could comfortably count, and it had grown the slow way, the way most things worth keeping seemed to grow, without either of them naming it while it was happening. On the 3rd evening, Damon asked to speak with her alone, before the tribunal convened. She agreed, mostly out of a curiosity she didn't examine too closely. He looked older than he had on the steps 3 days before, not in years, but in the particular way a man looks older once he's stopped being able to outrun what he's done. "I'm not going to ask you for mercy," he said. "I don't think I've earned the right to ask for it. I just wanted to say, before the tribunal, that I knew the rope was compromised. I didn't weaken it myself, but I knew, and I let it happen, because Cassandra convinced me it was the only clean way to manage a problem that threatened the balance the council had built. I've spent 2 weeks telling myself that made it someone else's choice. It didn't." "Why?" Freya said, the same single word she'd carried through every chapter of this, still hungry for the actual shape of the reason. "Because I was afraid," Damon said simply, "of exactly what Owen told you. A thorn line, fully grown, unaligned to any ruling family, with a stronger claim to this pack than my own, by simple right of blood. I told myself it was about stability, it was about fear. I don't know that those are different enough to matter, in the end." It was, Freya thought, the first wholly honest thing she'd heard him say since the ridge, and she found she didn't need it to fix anything between them. She only needed it said. The tribunal convened the next morning, in the same hall where she'd once watched a dozen trials as a girl, certain the ground beneath every leap was sound. The elders heard Owen's testimony on the stone, heard Garrett's account of the rope, heard Hannah and 11 other witnesses describe the wind, the silence, the failed right, the deer that had vanished from the lower meadows. Every entry in a ledger, none of them had known they were keeping, until it was finally read back to them in full. The judgment, when it came, was neither the mercy of forgiveness, nor the cruelty of exile dressed up as justice. Cassandra was stripped of her title, and the use of any reading stone for the rest of her life. Her decisions in every prior reading ordered re-examined by a council of elders, starting with Owen's case and working forward through 3 decades of records. Garrett, for his honesty and his failure both, was set to 10 years of border duty under another wolf's command, stripped of rank but not of pack, a long road back, not a door shut entirely. Damon's case took longest to decide, and in the end, the elders did something Hollowmere had not done in living memory. They called for a binding vote of the full pack, not the council alone, to determine whether the territory's leadership should pass to the strongest verified claim by blood, which was, by every reading now confirmed honest, Freya's to take, should she choose it. She stood before them all, 400 wolves who had spent 2 weeks slowly learning to ask harder questions of themselves than they were used to asking, and found that the easy answer, take what was hers, claim the throne the lie had been built to deny her, did not in fact feel like the true one. I don't want it, she said. Not because I couldn't carry it. I think I could, now, finally knowing what I actually am. But I came back to be seen, not to rule. If this pack wants a leader who earns trust the slow way, the honest way, let it be someone willing to be questioned by all of you, the way Damon never let himself be questioned. I'll stay close enough to help rebuild what was broken. I won't stay to wear a crown, built on the same silence that almost killed me. It was Hannah, in the end, the council elders agreed, who stepped forward to lead the interim council until a proper vote could be held the following season. Not because she was the strongest wolf in the gathering, but because she was the one who had felt the wind stop and trusted what she'd felt enough to keep asking, out loud, when it would have been easier not to. Beneath the hall, in stones that had held this land's ward since before any of them were born, something settled fully for the first time in 3 weeks, not because vengeance had been taken, but because the debt had finally, properly, been read in full and answered honestly, which the old ward, patient as stone, had apparently been willing to accept all along. There is an old observation, rarely spoken at gatherings because it offers no comfort and asks for none, that a pack's ground does not actually care who sits in the alpha's chair. It only cares whether the truth sitting beside that chair is allowed to speak. Hollowmere had spent 2 weeks learning, the hard way, that silence is its own kind of betrayal, no smaller for being quiet. Freya Thorn walked out of the hall that evening into ordinary, untroubled air. No wind rising to meet her, no magic announcing the moment, only the simple, unremarkable fact of having been heard at last, which turned out, against every expectation she'd carried up that ridge 3 weeks before, to be the entire point. Chapter 8. Seasons turned slowly in the high valleys, and Hollowmere's healing turned with them, not in a single dramatic spring, the way the old stories like to tell it, but in small, unglamorous increments that mattered more for being ordinary. The deer came back to the lower meadows first, cautious at first, then unbothered, the way wild things return to a place once they've decided, in whatever silent calculus governs such things, that it's safe again. The border sense returned within the month, faint at first, then steady, until patrol wolves stopped mentioning it at all, which was its own kind of proof that it had been fully restored. Freya did not stay in Hollowmere, in the end, though she did not leave it entirely either. She kept a small holding near its eastern edge, close enough to visit Hannah's growing council, close enough to watch, every few months, how the work of honest rebuilding was slower and less satisfying than any single act of revenge would have been, and how much more it actually seemed to matter for that slowness. Owen's case was the first the elders fully overturned. He was offered, at 71, formal reinstatement into the pack he'd left as a wounded 16-year-old, and accepted it on one condition, that he be allowed to keep his bees on Greywater land regardless, since by his own account, the bees had never once cared which side of a borderline they were technically supposed to belong to. Garrett served his 10 years of border duty without complaint, and within 2 of them had become, by Hannah's own account, the most careful and conscientious watchman the line had ever had. A man checking every rope, every stone, every quiet possibility of sabotage with the particular thoroughness of someone who had once let a single unchecked thing cost a person everything. Cassandra never returned to any position of authority. She lived out her remaining years in a small house at the pack's edge, tending a garden no one asked her to tend, and if she ever spoke of regret to anyone, she did not speak of it to Freya, who found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she had stopped needing her to. Damon did not seek the Alpha's chair again. He served instead as one voice among many on Hannah's council, not punished forever, not forgiven entirely, simply present. The way a debt that's being honestly worked off looks less like punishment and more like ordinary labor, season after season. As for Riker, he did not ask Freya to choose between Hollowmere and Greywater, and she did not ask it of him either. He built a second cabin, smaller than the first, on the edge of her new holding, close enough that the line between two old enemy territories began, slowly, without any formal treaty requiring it, to blur into something neither pack had a word for yet. 2 valleys worth of grudges, 11 years carried by a man who'd decided, one cold morning by a river, that an old wound wasn't hers to inherit, finally found their quiet, unspectacular end, not in a grand reconciliation between packs, but in the simple fact of 2 people choosing, every ordinary day, to keep choosing each other. "You could have left me in that river," Freya said to him once, years later, watching the bees Owen had finally agreed to share, between 2 holdings drift lazily across the boundary that used to mean something sharper than it did now. Hollowmere's debt, Greywater's grudge. "You didn't owe me anything." "No," Riker agreed, "I didn't. That's mostly why I stayed." He considered it a moment longer, the way he considered most things, slow and unhurried. Owing somebody makes it easy to walk away once the debt's paid. Choosing doesn't come with an ending built in. I liked that better. It is said, in the way these things are eventually said once enough seasons have passed to wear the sharp edges off a true story, that Hollowmere never forgot what its own silence had nearly cost it. Not the rope, not the fall, but the 18 years of small, comfortable lies that made the fall possible in the first place. The pack told it differently depending on who was doing the telling. Some called it the year the ward turned against its own people. Some called it the year the Truthkeeper's stone was finally read correctly. And the oldest among them, the ones who remembered watching a quiet, unremarkable girl climb a ridge believing the ground beneath her was sound, called it simply the year Hollowmere learned that a debt does not need a name to come due. It only needs a ledger, and patience, and someone, eventually, willing to read it honestly. Freya Thorn did not become the legend Hollowmere might once have built her into, had she taken the chair she was rightfully owed. She became something smaller, and, by her own quiet account, considerably harder to manage into a story with a clean moral. A woman who had been pushed off a cliff by people who loved the idea of a manageable daughter more than they loved the truth of an unmanageable one, and who came back not for vengeance, and not for a crown, but simply to be seen as exactly what she had always been, underneath every rigged number a frightened council had ever assigned her. The land remembered her for that. It is, after all, the only thing the old ground has ever actually kept score of. Not power, not bloodlines, not who sits where. Only whether the truth was finally allowed to stand where it belonged. There is a teaching, older than any pack now living, that says a lie survives only as long as the people telling it agree not to look at it too closely. Hollowmere looked closely, eventually, not quickly, not easily, and not without cost. That is perhaps the only honest thing this story can offer you. The truth rarely arrives the moment it's needed. It only arrives the moment someone finally agrees to ask the harder question. Freya never asked to be remembered as a legend. She only asked to be measured honestly, which, in the end, is the rarest thing any of us ever ask of the people meant to love us. If this story found something true in you, stay a while longer. There are other packs, other ledgers, other quiet girls the world measured wrong, and their stories deserve telling too. Subscribe if you'd like to be there when we tell them.